A letter on justice and open debate from Harper's Magazine, July 7th, 2020. Our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful protests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. But this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy. But resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion, which right-wing demagogues are already exploiting. Okay. The democratic inclusion we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides. Yeah, it's just one side. Okay. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counterspeech from all quarters, but it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders in a spirit of panicked damage control are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk aversion among writers, artists, journalists, who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus, or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement. This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without the other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. If we won't defend the very thing on which our work depends, we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend it for us. Signed, a long list of left-wing pedophiles. Okay. Conservative Yoram Hazoni responds, "People are asking me what I think of the Harper's letter. I think anyone defending free speech and viewpoint diversity right now deserves support. So I support the general point of the thing. Still, I have to say that this statement is pretty messed up. The most obvious way it's messed up is that too many of the signatories, not all, have themselves spent years systematically trying to stifle reasonable public debate by delegitimizing conservative voices and creating a context in which it's too costly to engage with them. I'm not talking about those signatories who have strongly disagreed with conservatives, nationalists, Christians, populists, and so on. Vigorous disagreement is all fine, good, and welcome. I'm talking about those signatories, far too many, who've accused conservatives of being authoritarian and anti-democracy, who've compared us to Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin, who've said we're theocrats, racists, sexists, and Islamophobes, enabling and collaborating. The latter is messed up because too many of the signatories kept quiet or took part as conservatives were being delegitimized, but now that it's liberals whose standing is in danger, suddenly they've realized they care immensely about free speech and viewpoint diversity. Okay, so that's human nature. People tend to defend their own in-group and their own interests. It's easier for a liberal to worry about whether we're all free to be liberals than to worry about whether we're free to be conservatives. I get it. But now, liberals are being persecuted and deplatformed. Now, liberals are thinking about the mistakes they've made, and they still don't get how messed up it is to collect 153 signatures for free speech and viewpoint diversity, but to exclude conservatives from it. What's messed up is this. They still don't understand the most basic thing about democracy, which is that you need two legitimate parties for democracy to work, one liberal and one conservative. This means that to have a democracy, liberals need to grant legitimacy to conservatives, even when they don't like them much. And conservatives need to grant legitimacy to liberals, even when they don't like them much. Nothing else is going to work. Here's what is not going to work. Liberals trying to exclude conservatives from legitimate discourse, because conservatives are the real threat, while at the same time they're granting ever more influence to the very neo-Marxists who are working to bring them down. It's not going to work because neo-Marxists aren't like conservatives. They don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in compromise. And they don't share power. That's why it's so messed up to read a letter on free speech and viewpoint diversity and find that it has no fewer than 3 different side comments aimed at delegitimizing conservatives worked into it. The reason for those asinine anti-conservative swipes is that many liberals still think they're going to get an alliance with the same neo-Marxists who are out to destroy them, and that the way to get there is by putting conservatives down. Which leads us to the last reason why this letter is so messed up. Its signatories don't seem to have a clue what time it is. They don't understand that the terrain has shifted beneath their feet. The left has just scored dozens of wins, including taking down James Bennett at the Times and taking out Woodrow Wilson at Princeton. There's blood in the water, and no one on the left is stupid enough to give in to these liberal bribes now. Liberals only have 2 choices. Either they'll submit to the neo-Marxists, or they'll try to put together a pro-democracy alliance with conservatives. There aren't any other choices. And to be clear, I don't mean an alliance with the never-Trumpers that liberal outfits keep on their platforms so they can pretend to be dialoguing with the other. Most of them aren't conservatives, and they certainly don't bring the conservative public with them. I'm talking about a rebuilding, a stable public sphere constructed around 2 legitimate political parties, one liberal and one consisting of actual conservatives, meaning people that a broad conservative public would recognize as their own. In other words, not Bill fucking Kristol, you absolute degenerates. Maybe liberals just aren't smart enough to see that this is what they've got to do. Maybe they aren't gutsy enough to do it. Maybe most liberal intellectuals are just going to keep hoping for love from the neo-Marxists until it's all over. Could be. But for now, 2 cheers for the Harper's letter supporting free speech and viewpoint diversity. Anyone defending free speech and viewpoint diversity at this time deserves support, so I support the general point of the thing, even if it is pretty messed up.